Today we're going to have our second video on character and plot, scene, and summary. So this is the second time we're talking about each of these. If you haven't watched the previous videos on these subjects, please go back and watch them. We're adding on to that information now. So primarily the stories that we're reading this semester and what I'm going to ask you to write are character driven. That means that the characters take action and drive the plot along. If you remember, this is what we talked about in our last discussion of plot. This is true of Apollo and Bullet in the Brain, although in different ways. In Apollo, our narrator drives the plot in a few different ways, starting from our exposition and our strange inciting incident in that story. And in Bullet in the Brain, Anders, in our introduction, is responsible for his own death, but then we also get to see the various ways that his life has led him to this point. So in Apollo, the guilty memory of Raphael and the fact that our main character had to hide his sexuality from his parents when he was a child, but then also as an adult. If you go back and read through the introduction, the exposition to that story again, you'll see that he is still hiding things from them. That is what forces this plot along and also drives our narrator's actions in the backstory, which is the majority of the piece. Those actions cause Raphael is the main one, to react to him in a certain way, and then his anger at Raphael at the end for not reciprocating his feelings, for being interested in someone else, depending on how you read that. That causes him to tell the lie that then makes Raphael basically unemployable for the rest of his life. If you attack, in Raphael's position, if you attack the child that you're supposed to be taking care of, you are not going to be employed again. In Bullet in the Brain, Anders is responsible for his own death, as I've said, and this is due to his general judgmental attitude that was growing ever since he left college. And there are the few hints of him having a normal life, of him being a happy person, but then slowly he starts to resent the books that he has to read and critique, and he resents people for writing them. He doesn't have a good relationship with his daughter. He doesn't have a good relationship with his ex-wife. He no longer takes pleasure in these things. So Anders drives this plot along as well. So our characters' actions and their choices must have impact on our stories. They must be able to change things, and that ability to change things offers hope for our reader and for our characters, that they can affect the world that they live in. The reader wants them to be able to act and affect things. The other option for the character's impact is that they're responsible for their current situation. In most cases, in good fiction, both of those things are true. Our characters have the ability to change things, and they are also responsible for whatever predicament they find themselves in any moment in time. If the characters can't currently affect what's happening, there must be some other conflict going on. For example, if this is an example that I've drawn from past stories students have submitted. If there's a parent with severe illness, cancer is a popular one, and our character isn't a doctor, isn't some type of savant, doesn't have any magical property that allows them to cure cancer, can't donate an organ, if that would be the thing. There's nothing they can do about that. Then there must be another conflict. Just having a parent with cancer is not enough to drive a story. The character must struggle with something else. Grief is a common option in that case, although there can be other options. Another example would be if our character can't control the weather and there's a giant tornado coming, there must be something else that the character has to struggle with. In this case, they might have to convince their family to pack up and not be in Kansas anymore. But just running away from the tornado is okay, but they can't win necessarily. They can't stop a tornado, right? Unless they have some magical powers again. If you think about Bullet in the Brain, the conflict, the tension in that story doesn't come really from Anders and the bank robbers. The tension comes from, okay, how did this guy get to be such an asshole that he's arguing with bank robbers in the first place, people with guns who frighten him. He can't keep his mouth shut. So what happened to get him to this point? And the tension there, is somewhat resolved over the course of the story, but mostly the tension lingers because at the end we see that Anders, whom we might hate at the beginning of the story, Anders was once just a happy kid playing baseball. He hears something that sticks in his head and he keeps on thinking about it. So let's talk about scene summary a little bit more with regards to these pieces. Our intro to Apollo uses mostly summary, which is not what I've recommended you do, but it is possible here, especially because at the end of that exposition, we slide into scene. We have that story about Raphael, which starts out as just another example of the crazy things that our narrator's parents tell him. But then it turns into an actual dialogue, and our narrator is struck dumb by the fact that this terrible thing has happened to Raphael. And the rest of the story is talking about why he's responsible for this. Bullet in the Brain opens in scene, a very vivid scene in the bank that culminates with Anders being shot in the head. But the emotional heart of the story happens in very vivid details that act as a summary for Anders' entire life. And then again, at the very end, we switch back to a vivid, detailed scene of that ball game. We only have a few moments of the ball game, but we have so many senses being evoked in that passage that it sticks in the reader's mind. The pace slows dramatically there. So they shake up that traditional short story form. Opening and summary, killing off the main character pretty early. That's normally something I would recommend you avoid unless you're writing something speculative where our main character, can come back to life or comes back as a ghost or is somehow acting as the narrator for the whole piece. We have Bullet in the Brain with the majority of the story in summary, and for both of these stories, the majority of the story happens in the past. So because both of these stories happen in the past for the majority of them, this changes the tension in the story. The question changes from what will they do to how did they get here? How did our narrator in Apollo get to the point where they're told a story about someone that his parents think that he shouldn't even remember Raphael, but of course he remembers Raphael. Raphael was his first love, and he got angry at Raphael for flirting with someone else, and then lied about him and ruined his life. So both pieces still, even though the majority of the story happens in the past, both pieces hinge on scene. In Apollo, that scene happens at the end of our exposition, but then the entire past of the story happens in scene for the most part. There are very few summaries. And in the Wolf story, Bullet in the Brain, our exposition is entirely scene, where we get to see how terrible Anders is, and then the end of the story, which is meant to be a redeeming moment for him, where we finally feel sad that this terrible person who put everyone's life in danger actually was a decent person at some time. All right, so let me know if you have any questions, and thanks for watching.